Imagine you're an average Englishman living in the 15th century. Your king has just died, and his 12-year-old son is now the new monarch. You probably think this will be a time of peace and prosperity. But then a few months later, that same king marries a commoner. A commoner who used to be married to one of your friends. A commoner who also happens to be your king's former mistress. And she's got 4 kids from that affair already. Yeah, I don't know about you, but if I heard that my king had just married his ex-mistress, the mother of his illegitimate children, while still only being 12 years old, I would think that something was very wrong with his king. If you were King Edward IV's counselors, you would have agreed wholeheartedly. So much so that they tried to convince the king not to marry Elizabeth Woodville at all. But once he had made up his mind, there was no changing it. Welcome to my channel. Today, we are exploring the shocking secret marriage of King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, and how it changed the course of history. Henry VI's untimely death on May 31st, 1471, left a power vacuum in England. The throne now belonged to his son, King Edward IV, who was only 12 years old at the time. Since he was too young to rule, his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, acted as his regent during his minority. Now, those of you who are well versed in your Tudor history might be thinking, wait, wasn't Richard III supposed to be the evil uncle who murdered the princes in the Tower? Well, yes. But in order to understand what happened next, we need to start from the beginning. When Henry VI died, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was in France with the English army trying to win back some of the territory that the English had lost to the French during the 100 Years' War. Upon hearing of his brother's death, Richard immediately set out for England, arriving at Dover on June 1471. At this point, he began to make plans to marry the young king to a suitable foreign princess. The most likely candidate was the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, Jacqueline of Luxembourg, who was around Edward's age and whose father, Charles the Bold, had recently died, making her a free agent. However, before Richard could secure this match, Edward met Elizabeth Woodville, a 23-year-old widow and former lady-in-waiting to Queen Isabella of France. Richard hated the idea of his nephew marrying a commoner, especially since she was a member of the rival House of Lancaster, which made her a Yorkist. He refused to give his consent and ordered the wedding preparations to stop. But Edward went ahead with the ceremony anyway, secretly marrying Elizabeth Woodville on May 1st, 1472. Now, you might be asking yourself, who is Elizabeth Woodville, and how did she become Edward's choice for queen? Well, Elizabeth was born in 1437, the daughter of Sir John Woodville and Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Yes, that Jacquetta of Luxembourg, the same Jacquetta whose hand Edward's counselors wanted him to marry. Coincidence? Perhaps. Elizabeth grew up in the court of King Henry VI, where she formed a close relationship with the Queen Isabella of France. She was considered beautiful, with long flowing red hair, pale skin, and gray eyes. And she was well educated for a woman of her time, speaking French and Italian. She also knew how to hunt and hawk, which must have appealed to the more masculine side of young Edward. Elizabeth first became the king's mistress when he was only 9 years old, and by the time he was 12, she was pregnant with his child. In fact, Elizabeth already had 3 children with Edward, 2 daughters and a son, who had been legitimized by the king and given the surname Beaufort. This didn't stop Edward from wanting to marry Elizabeth, though. In fact, he was determined to make her his queen. When he learned that she had secretly wed Sir John Faining, he accused her of doing it to spite him and forced her to annul the marriage. Then, on April 1st, 1472, against the advice of his counselors, he married Elizabeth Woodville in a small ceremony at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. The couple kept their marriage a secret for over a year, with Elizabeth continuing to live openly with the title of Marchioness of Dorset. During this time, Elizabeth gave birth to Edward's 4th child, another son named Henry, This child was legitimized as well, receiving the surname Beaufort like his siblings. In the meantime, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, finally returned to England from France in July of 1472. Shortly after he arrived, he summoned the newlyweds to meet with him, so he could finally put his plan to marry Edward to the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy into action. But when he realized that the marriage between his nephew and Elizabeth Woodville was no secret, he flew into a rage. He ripped off Edward's crown and smashed it on the ground, declaring that the marriage was illegal and that Elizabeth was no queen. Nonetheless, he allowed the marriage to stand and accepted Elizabeth and her children as members of the royal family. However, he continued to try to persuade Edward to marry someone else. In fact, he even went so far as to imprison Elizabeth in her own rooms at Windsor Castle, but it was to no avail. Edward loved Elizabeth and refused to divorce her. Richard eventually gave up, realizing that he could never force the young king to abandon her. However, his resentment towards Elizabeth did not go away. In fact, it only grew when Edward made her and her children his heirs. This meant that Richard would never be able to secure the throne for himself. In addition to this, Richard believed that Elizabeth was using witchcraft to control Edward, and that she had bewitched him against her. For example, he wrote to one of his servants accusing her of cursing him with a white or red-hot musket ball, and said that her sorcery was responsible for the recent death of the Earl of Northumberland, one of Richard's friends. Richard's hatred towards Elizabeth eventually led him to kidnap the young princes in the Tower and murder them. But that is a story best saved for another day. What is important to remember here is that without Elizabeth Woodville, Richard would never have felt the need to kill the princess. It was her presence at court and the fact that she had Edward's undying love that threatened Richard's claim to the throne. Therefore, we can thank Elizabeth for saving the lives of those innocent boys. But let's get back to our story. Now that Richard had given up on marrying Edward to the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, he set his sights on securing a match with Princess Anne of France, the sister of King Louis XI. Richard hoped that this marriage would bring France and England closer together and end the 100 Years' War once and for all. Edward, however, hated the idea of his cousin becoming queen and would have none of it. He was in love with Elizabeth and had no intention of divorcing her. Richard knew that he could never force the king to accept Anne, so he decided to simply ignore the issue and pretend that she wasn't even there. He welcomed Anne to England and treated her like a sister, all the while continuing to plot ways to get rid of Elizabeth. In the end, Richard's efforts were in vain, and he died in 1483 with Elizabeth Woodville still by Edward's side. Elizabeth and Edward ruled together for 14 happy years, until Edward's death in 1483. Elizabeth was a popular queen, known for her intelligence and ability to speak several languages. She was also a patron of the arts and helped to promote the careers of many famous writers and artists. Edward, on the other hand, was a weak king who was more interested in hunting and hawking than in ruling. He was also a heavy drinker and womanizer, which made him unpopular with his subjects. Despite their differences, Edward and Elizabeth were deeply in love and remained faithful to each other throughout their marriage. They had 8 children together, 5 sons and 3 daughters, all of whom survived to adulthood. After Edward's death, Elizabeth became the most powerful woman in England, acting as regent during the reign of her eldest son, Edward V. She held this position until her death in 1492. Although she was a member of the rival House of Lancaster, Elizabeth Woodville played an important role in ending the Wars of the Roses and uniting the 2 houses of York and Lancaster under the Tudor dynasty. Without her, the course of English history could have been very different. So what do you think? Did you know about Elizabeth Woodville before watching this video? What do you admire most about her? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this one.